This is Amy Poehler. My new movie, Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2, is coming to theaters June 14th, and it's making me feel joy and sadness and anger, definitely some disgust, and I think a little fear. Really? But I'm also feeling these new emotions like anxiety, embarrassment, envy, and ennui.
It's what you call the boredom.
Okay, that one was weird. It's gonna be the feel everything movie of the summer. Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2, only in theaters June 14th. Get tickets now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Underrated Movie Podcast. This is a podcast where we discuss films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have slipped under the radar and passed most people by. This is the second episode of a mini-series we're doing called Extended Edition, where we look at extended editions, director's cuts, other releases of films other than their theatrical versions. And the film that we'll be looking at today is Alien 3, and we'll be looking at specifically the Assembly Cut. This film, of course, was brought to me a while back, and I'm finally glad we are finally getting the chance to do it by another podcaster, Perry Constantine. Perry has a couple shows. I've been on both those. Before we get to Alien 3, how's it going, Perry?
It's going pretty good, Derek. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this movie today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. But before we get into it, tell us people about your shows. You do the superhero cinephiles, and you do Japan on Film. I don't know if you wanted to mention what those are about.
I'm always happy to self-promote, so I appreciate the opportunity. Yes, I do have two podcasts. Japan on Film started first, actually, but it actually has fewer episodes just because we switched to a season format at one point. I took a hiatus at another point. So with that show, it started off with me doing just solo episodes talking about Japanese movies because I had started teaching a class on Japanese film, and I live in Japan. Japanese movies are part of the reason why I wanted to come out here in the first place. And so when I got a chance to teach a class, I realized that there were so many movies I wanted to talk about, and I didn't have enough classes in the semester. So I started talking about them in front of a microphone. And then after about, 18 or 19 episodes, I decided to switch it up and start bringing on different guests, such as yourself. You've been on a few times. And it's been a lot of fun. We're part of the We Made This network, and a lot of great discussions about Japanese film and using Japanese movies as kind of a way to discuss Japanese society, Japanese culture, history, all that kind of fun stuff. And then the other show I do is called Superhero Cinephiles. That was originally started as an excuse because my buddy and I, also Derek Ferguson, I basically wanted an excuse to talk with him more. And so I asked him if he wanted to do a podcast about superhero movies. We did that for about 60 episodes together, but then unfortunately he passed away. And in the time since, I have been continuing it with different guests, again, such as yourself. In that show, we just tackle a different superhero movie in every episode, talk about some of the more popular ones, talk about some of the more obscure ones, and we've done some topic type episodes too, where we discuss different aspects of superhero movies. We did one on politics, we did one on romance, we did one on secret identities. Most recently, we did a ranking of the now ended DCEU, so that was also a fun one. And yeah, that's been going we're coming up on 200 episodes on that now, actually.
Very nice. Congratulations. Yeah, those shows are both a ton of fun. And yeah, I, as you mentioned, have been on both. I had a great time talking about some of my favorite movies and some new ones as well on those shows. So yeah, definitely everyone should go check that out. But yeah, today, as we mentioned, we're going to be talking about Alien 3, a movie that you've wanted to talk to me about. You were like, oh, underrated, Alien 3. And it's a movie that I agree is definitely underrated, particularly this cut, which as we mentioned is the Assembly, or some people sometimes call the Alien 3 Special Edition. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this movie, obviously, third in the Alien franchise, directed by David Fincher, who is kind of disowned the film, and that's why this is not a director's cut, which I think is interesting, but it's the Assembly cut because he had nothing when Fox came back and did special editions, director's cuts of all of the 4 Alien films. He wanted no involvement in that whatsoever. So yeah, obviously, Sigourney Weaver stars in this. It's written by a bunch of screenwriters, and we might get into that, along with a ensemble cast of about every bald actor that was available in the 90s. But Perry,
except for Patrick Stewart.
That's fair. Yeah, no Patrick Stewart.
The only bald British guy they couldn't get was Patrick Stewart.
Yeah, exactly. He had done his time in a sci-fi epic with a director who disowned it when he did Dune. But yeah, Perry, what made you want to talk about this one?
So Alien 3 was actually the first Alien movie I saw. Oh. Back when I was a kid, my sister and I, we'd spend summers in Florida with our grandparents, and there was a library nearby, and we'd always go there and rent VHS tapes. And, my grandparents didn't really care about ratings. I don't even think they knew what movie ratings were. So we just would go there by our own, and we just get whatever we thought was interesting. And so I got exposed to a lot of movies, a lot younger than I probably should have, now that I think about it. And Alien 3 was one of those. And so that was my first exposure to the Alien films, was that. And then over time, eventually I watched the first one and the second one. And then once the internet came about, I saw all the discourse online about Alien 3 and everyone talking about like, oh my God, this movie's terrible. It killed the franchise. And I'm just like, I kind of liked it. And I was thinking to myself, like, was I wrong all those years? I mean, I was just a kid when I saw it. Maybe it's just, nostalgia coloring my opinion of it. So then when I was in university, I had a chance to take a class in horror films. And for my final paper, I decided I was going to write an analysis of all three of those movies, leaving out Alien Resurrection, and kind of chart Ripley's journey throughout it. And I realized that even though it does have a lot of problems, which we'll probably get into, there's a surprisingly consistent character arc throughout all three movies. And all three work together to tell a really masterful, actually, tragic story of Ripley and her relationship with the xenomorph. So I gained a whole new level of appreciation for all three of them working in tandem with each other after writing that paper.
Yeah, I really agree that they do really work as a trilogy. I know obviously there's a fourth one and there's, the Prometheus and Covenant. Obviously that's separate from Ripley. Spoiler alert, if you guys haven't seen this, obviously Ripley dies at the end of this. She is, as Alien Resurrection, the fourth one implies, they clone and resurrect her in that one. It's kind of goofy.
It's a mess. I mean, it does have there is some interesting stuff though. When you look at it and you focus like on the pirate crew, you can kind of see Joss Whedon's early DNA for Firefly in that.
Yeah, exactly.
But outside of that, there's not really a whole lot to enjoy about that movie.
Yeah, it's very much playing it safe, whereas this one I feel like is really trying something different, really swinging for the fences, and really carrying over those thematic elements from the first two films. And it really feels like this is the end of Ripley's journey. This is that, like, there's a lot of stuff about like trauma and sexual assault and all this stuff that are like tied up with the alien. And when she'll say things like, she looks at the alien, she's like, "You've been in my life so long, I don't even remember a time before." Like, I had to write that down. That was such an interesting moment. And by the end of this, she's realizes she's got the alien queen living inside her, and she's just like, "I've got to die. I've got to like let go." And this movie is kind of all about her kind of coming to grips with that. I think that there's the choice to kill off Newton Hicks at the beginning is a controversial one, and one that it doesn't work well for the series as a whole. I feel like it kind of undercuts the ending of the last Alien movie, but I think for this movie it really works with her experiencing this trauma, because I feel like that's what she is. Ripley is a survivor, and this movie is all about her having survived these two horrific elements and dealing with the trauma of that, basically being a mother who has watched her child die, and they even kind of point that out. He originally asks her, Charles Dance asks her, like, "Oh, are you her mother?" And she says no, but really she essentially is. And that's the aliens, and now she's going to be the mother to the alien. She doesn't want that. And there's all this interesting stuff tied to gender in this movie about the alien being like the queen, and of course she famously is just like, you bitch in the second one. But this one, she goes to a planet of all men, and not just men, but like they make a point of being like, these are double Y chromosome men. So like essentially just like even on a genetic level, men who are more men than than anybody else. So I thought that was all really fascinating.
They're also they're part of this extreme religious cult, basically, too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's I never noticed this until now, but when Clemens is talking about the kind of religion that Dylan and the other convicts have come to embrace, he calls it like this apocalyptic millennial Christian fundamentalist thing, and Ripley says right, and he says very, or exactly, or something along those lines. Just like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what they're so it's like this extreme right wing cult, basically, is what she's fallen into on this planet. And not only that, but a lot of them are former rapists. Like Dylan, the unofficial leader of the convicts, he makes a point of telling that. He's like, you don't want to know me later. I'm a killer, I'm a murderer, and a rapist of women. So there's a lot of stuff with that on there too. And I do want to talk about the Hicks and Newt thing, because I think that is something that a lot of people talk about. That's been like the ultimate complaint about this movie from the beginning. And I push back on the idea that it doesn't work with the other movies, or that it's because all these movies have been about surviving and when people talk about how they killed Hicks and Newt, and it had such a great ending, I'm like, well, yeah, but I think that good ending, that upbeat ending, was kind of incongruous from the first movie, right? It's this idea of like, that whole line about how she says, now we can both dream, or anything like that. I'm just like, it's a horror franchise first and foremost, and I think that James Cameron kind of got away from that in his movie. I mean, as much fun as it is, as great as that movie is, and especially when you look at the director's cut of Aliens, when it has all the stuff about her biological daughter, right? The fact that she had been in hypersleep for 60 years, and her daughter, who had been a little girl when she left Earth, had grown old and died in the time that she was in hypersleep. And then so she comes back and she forms this kind of surrogate family then, with, Hicks becoming like a surrogate husband and Newt becoming a surrogate daughter. And it's a contrast to what the alien did to her, because basically the alien stole her family from her in the first movie. And in the second movie, she then steals the alien's family from the queen. She kills all of them, leaving only the queen left. And then they have the big grudge match at the end. And it is really a battle of mother versus mother in that scene. And then in this movie, the alien gets revenge, and they literally merge into one. Like the alien, because she's carrying the alien queen in her, so they have literally become one and the same in that final movie. So it's gone from this very, and also you talked about the ideas of gender. Like if you look back at that first movie, one of the interesting things that I think it was Dan O'Bannon who wrote the screenplay, if I'm remembering correctly, he had intentionally not used any first names in the screenplay so that the characters could be either gender when they got to the casting stage. And when you look at that movie and you look at the way gender is represented, you have two women on board. You have Ripley, and you have, I can't remember the other one, but
Victoria Cartwright's character, I can't remember her name.
Yeah, Victoria Cartwright's character, whatever her name was. But you remember, she is borderline hysterical for most of that movie, whereas Ripley is like this, is calm, she's cool, she's collected, she's got her shit together. And so there's this kind of weird game thing with gender, in the fact that it's Ripley assumes some of the more masculine traits in a way, whereas and stereotypically, obviously, whereas Victoria Cartwright's character assumes some of the more stereotypical feminine traits. And then you also have the whole idea with the computer mother in there as well, and Ripley's the only one to survive in that. So it's playing this weird game with gender, where it's kind of like she's the only one who's not punished because she doesn't adhere to the stereotypes of gender, whereas in the second one, then it becomes much more about femininity and motherhood and all that. And then in this one, there's also an aspect of sexuality in here, because this is the first time in any of the movies that Ripley actually has sex with someone.
Yeah, she gets hers. She gets some. Charles Dance. Yeah. Good for her.
Yeah. but sexuality is because, like, you had the romantic interest obviously between her and Hicks, but it
Mhm.
was very kind of PG, right? It was very kind of
Yeah.
like chaste. Whereas this one, it's just like, I've been out in space for what, like probably the better part of 80 years now. I haven't gotten laid in 80 years. I want to have sex. And also I'm going to use it strategically too, right? She's using
Mhm.
she's using her sexuality in some ways. Like, even when she confronts Dylan in that scene, when he says, like, I'm a killer and a rapist of women, and she says that I must make you very uncomfortable, and she sits down right across from him, right? She stands
Mhm.
right up to that. And there is that whole line too that she says when she finds out that she's carrying the alien. She says, I've been violated. So
Mhm.
the sexuality becomes much more front and center in that third movie.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I totally see what you're saying about the set, especially I think like Aliens. Obviously, I love that film. Great action movie. Some of James Cameron's best work for sure. But yeah, it does feel very different. And obviously, the first Alien is a straight up like a horror, a space thriller, or you'll call it. Whereas this, the second time around, it's about macho guys with guns going in, space marines, going to fight the aliens and stuff like that. And I think it does the same thing that a lot of movies that were 80s movies that were sequels to 70s movies did, which made them thinking of, like, a couple movies by Sylvester Stallone, for example. You have Rocky 1, that's, and then you have Rocky 2, he comes back and he wins the fight. Or First Blood, it's this movie about a veteran coming back and how he has no place in society, and then First Blood Part 2, he's like going back to Vietnam and like winning the Vietnam War. They shifted to much more like 80s Reagan conservative, just like rah rah, we're gonna go like shoot all the guys and win, much more traditional quote unquote family values. And that's what kind of, not in a like jingoistic way or anything, but I think that Aliens does that too, where it's like, yeah, now Ripley is part of this like nuclear family. She, like you said, she's got her faux daughter, her faux husband, and they do kind of like live happily ever after. And I do think that really works for that movie. But yeah, it is, especially of the three originals, it's the one that feels like it's a totally different genre. And there's always weird differences in, like, this is the series where I think it fluctuates most from film to film in terms of just like genre beats. But this one really pulls it back to, okay, aliens are scary again. Like, there's just like the first one, there's not one. It's not like you're going down a hallway and just seeing like a number go down of how many of these monsters there are. There's one thing in there, and I think they do use some interesting tricks to make this thing kind of terrifying. First of all, and this might have been connected to the fact that Sigourney Weaver just didn't want guns prominently featured, but they don't have really weapons other than just like torches and stuff like that to fight the alien, so it becomes that much scary because they can't just like shoot it. And second of all, it's a new interesting design which we haven't seen before. I think the way that Fincher shoots it is very reminiscent of the first Alien, and this one, we're in the 90s, so they have some CG stuff that they can kind of put in, but it's still very limiting. This is before Jurassic Park comes out. And I think maybe some of it was added in the assembly cut, but still, like, you can tell it's like early 90s CG. And it's like the same thing with Jaws. It's like they're limited by what they can show, so they don't show a lot. Like, I was kind of like surprised watching it this time just how little of the actual alien there is. And they don't even really know there is like, they have their suspicions, but they don't really know there is an alien until about the 1 hour mark.
Yeah, it does. It's actually like about the halfway point, really, that Ripley officially knows that something's going, that she knows for certain that it's the alien. And that's another thing that this movie plays with, is this idea of like, trauma and survivor's guilt too, which is another reason why I think it was a good choice to kill Hicks and Newt off. I wasn't aware about the guns thing with Sigourney Weaver, but that would make a lot of sense. But it works very well because, and you're right about those other 80s movies. I think what sets Aliens apart from it is, yeah, it does have kind of like the conservative values of the traditional nuclear family and all that. But one of the ways that it differs is that it was like, in the beginning, it seems like, oh, rah, jingoistic 80s movie. But, and James Cameron has said this, it's basically a metaphor for Vietnam. You've got this, massively equipped, overpowered force. They're going after this under-equipped civilization that they think of as savages, and the quote-unquote savages, beat the ever-loving shit out of them. So that it works pretty well on that level. But one of the things that I think kind of disappointed me about Aliens is that it kind of reduces the impact of how dangerous a threat the xenomorphs are, which the original one did so well. And then this one, I think, also brings us back to. Whereas in that one, you've got this, you've got hallways full of aliens, you've got Marines gunning them down, and it loses some of that impact, I think, of how terrifying each one of these things, just one of them is. And this one brings back that terrifying notion that this is how much trouble that one of these aliens can cause. It's also a bit different from. It's interesting that it's got some of the aspects of it with the vents and all that, like we had in the first one, but it's a bigger area to play with. We have a slightly bigger cast of people, and they also do some interesting things with the Weyland-Yutani guys in this too, because whereas in Aliens we had we had Ian Holmes' character, the android. Aliens, we had Burke, who's also this like kind of company man, and we kind of see the beginnings of that with Andrews, the superintendent, but he ends up getting killed right away. And then the only person we have after that is 85, who's like, his second in command. And he's an idiot, right? He doesn't know what he's doing. He's not malicious, though, about anything. He's not like Burke, who's just like, all these people are expendable. He's someone who's just stupid enough to actually believe that the company is going to do what they say they're going to do. So that creates an interesting dynamic that we haven't seen in the movies, because here's someone who is doing the company line, but doing it for very different reasons. And then we have people like Clemens, who I think is one of the best characters, Charles Dance, in this movie. And I think one of the places that I think this movie falls apart, not falls apart, but one of the downsides of it is that after you have Clemens and Andrews die, all the heavy lifting of the characters basically falls down to Sigourney Weaver and Charles Dutton, as Ripley and Dylan. And there's a big personality vacuum in the second half of the movie as a result of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and it's not like the other guys aren't good actors. You have like people like Pete Postlethwaite and stuff absolutely, like Spielberg said.
If Pete Postlethwaite had a bigger role, he had more to do, and I think he could have definitely stepped it up. Like, I think if he had been playing the Morse character, I think it would have been a lot more interesting. Whereas the guy who played Morse doesn't really do much for me.
Yeah, and like you said, there's just not a lot for these guys to do other than just and part of it is because they're all just like bald dudes, like, running around. They all kind of like look the same. It's hard to kind of at points you're like, wait, and it's all like the way it's lit too. You're like, it's all because it's stark and grime. You're like, which bald guy is this at certain times, But yeah, like you said, Charles Dance in this is really phenomenal, and you are like, it's really a bummer when he dies, but that is such a great moment, and you're sad that he's not in more of the film, but it really hits that he dies at about that halfway point. When Ripley, sees this alien, because she's finally found something to be happy about. She's finally found, it's not perfect, but she's found, hey, here's a guy, he's kind of fucked up just the way that I'm kind of fucked up, like we both have these dark pasts, these traumas that we've lived through. And, he's not able to forgive himself in the same way she's not able to forgive herself for a lot of the things that has happened in their own past. And she's like, okay, cool. I found this guy. Like you said, it's the first time that Ripley gets laid in any of these movies. She's cool. She's having a good time, and they're talking and stuff like that. And then out of nowhere, boom, it's back. The alien comes back, gets him in the head with a pretty cool effects shot, just like cracks his skull. And she's like, oh, I'm fucked again. She sees the alien doesn't attack her for some reason. That sends her off on.
I got to mention that iconic shot of the close-up of the alien right next to her head like that. That's amazing shot right there.
One of the most iconic shots in the franchise, and a couple, because I went through and actually I didn't watch these movies until I was an adult and probably my mid-20s or something, and I didn't realize that shot was from this movie at first. I thought it was like from one of the ones that people think of, the quote-unquote good ones, because that shot is so iconic. Like, arguably maybe the most iconic shot in any of these films where it's just got the thing, it's got the second mouth that comes out, and I think that is just so cool. And other than the alien looking really cool in that moment, she looks great. Like, she rocks the bald head in this movie. Sigourney Weaver is an absolute badass in this, and she's always a badass, but like at this point, she's just seen so much shit. She has just dealt with so much of this alien bullshit that she's like, all right, whatever. I'm ready to go. I don't care. Like, I'm here with these guys. This apocalyptic death cult of like, super conservative, hardcore Christian, like murder rapist prisoners or whatever. She's just fucking done with it at this point. And it's like, yeah, shave my head, whatever. I'm gonna fucking go.
Well, yeah, I think this might be, and I know a lot of people, I think people who say this were only going off the theatrical cut, but when they say that she doesn't show a lot of emotion in this movie, I'm watching this, I'm just like, I don't think you guys watched this version of the movie, because I think this is one of the best performances she has ever done in any movie. She goes through so many emotions, and in the short amount of time, it makes you believe every single one of them. They all feel completely genuine. You mentioned the thing that with Clemens in their past. You know what? I had not even picked up on that, but as you were saying it all clicked together for me. You're right. His recklessness caused the deaths of these other people. And in a way, even though you could say that she wasn't reckless, like, she does feel responsible for the deaths that the aliens caused on the LV planet, and now here, and Hicks and Newt. She feels responsible for all that. That responsibility still weighs on her heavily. And just like and also the fact that she shaves her head too. I agree with you too. I think they should have found a way to have her head shaved, or without having it be like everyone is bald, or have some sort of other way to differentiate them. Like, maybe they have tattoos or something like that, or maybe, they're wearing different clothing. But when they're all dressed the same, they're all shaved heads, it's a bunch of bald white British guys for the most part. They all blend together. And especially with the darkness. So it is very hard to kind of follow along. I mean, one of the best, I think the fact that, Charles Dutton is black and he wears glasses helps set him apart more than any of the others. But otherwise, they all just kind of merge together. Plus, Dutton's got an amazing performance in this too. Like, Dylan has so much personality in this movie that it's impossible not to notice him. One of the interesting things too about the bald head thing is the fact that physically, in appearance-wise, this is the least feminine she's been in all three movies. And yet this is when she's at her sexual peak in the movies, too.
Yeah, definitely. She really pulls it off. I think, like, that not everybody can pull off a bald look, especially not a lot of women can pull off a bald look, but she really does. And like I said, yeah, she's definitely in her sexual peak in this one, which is weird because, like, in other movies, like, I wouldn't say the camera does kind of, I feel like, linger on her at certain points, especially in that first one. She's like wearing just her underwear, and like, so you can take that. And I love that Sigourney Weaver apparently when that movie was like, yeah, show my pubes, like, whatever. Like, I'm not gonna shave around it. She made them do that, but this one, it's like kind of like, yeah, the opposite. She's just like wearing just frumpy clothes, like bald head, but she just owns it. And what I too was gonna say about Dylan, that character, he kind of takes over as the second lead. I think like Charles Dance kind of is in the first half, whereas he kind of, like you said, really becomes her sidekick, the person who is most with her on that journey. And I love that he's just this reluctant leader. Like, he's become the leader to these men, despite him not wanting that. And I think the reason is because, yeah, like, this is this, apocalyptic cult of all these people who have these dark pasts and stuff like that. But he is really doing it for... He's a real believer, He's not someone who's just like, oh yeah, I can like kind of just do this as a way to like seem like I'm taking the easy way out to like reform or whatever, or someone who just thinks like, oh, if I say all these things, I'll get into heaven. He is someone who is clearly, really, just like Ripley, as we mentioned, really has a heavy heart for his past. Like, he feels very guilty for his past transgressions. He, like we said, he straight up tells her about them when he first meets her. He's like, I'm not a good person. And even though everything we see him do in this movie is pretty heroic, pretty great, we know that he is acting this way because he feels deep shame about his past. And I love that he gets to have this kind of great sacrificial moment there at the end, and kind of like, he's like, yeah, like, he does, he's not obviously someone who would like choose to die because to him, I think that would be the easy way up. But if he has to give his life in a moment, he's not going to hesitate, as we see.
No, absolutely, yeah. And two, about going, I want to go back to the bald head thing again too, because another thing that this movie does, and again, I think people misread some of the stuff in this movie when they talk about how she's so suicidal in this that she wants to die. Why doesn't she just kill herself then, or something like that? But I mean, there's also this whole idea of dealing with terminal illness. I mean, that also is kind of implied by the bald head too, like, you know, people who are dealing with cancer and going through chemo. So there's so much stuff that she goes through in this movie, and yeah, Dylan, he really takes over and he fills a good portion of that personality void once Clemens is gone. I still feel like there's something lacking there without Clemens in there, and I feel like, you know, if we just kept him alive maybe a little bit longer, then we could have seen something. But also going to the whole thing about the past, one of the scenes that I think has aged poorly in this, and which I don't like, is the attempted rape scene. I think that's just that's something that I feel like that now we get to a point where we're beating a dead horse. Like we get what we've been trying to say. We don't need to go this far. I also don't like the fact that, I mean, I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to give Dylan a moment to kind of show that, you know, he walks the walk, he talks the talk. But by having Dylan be the one to save Ripley, I feel like it robs Ripley of some of that agency that she had been building up over the course of the whole series. And then to just come in and then, you know, have a man come in and save her. And yeah, she does get her licks in where she beats the guy over the head after that. But still, I feel like I would have liked it if it was something like she ends up fighting them off and then Dylan comes in, realizes what happened, and then he's the one to deliver the blow when the guy's on the ground. I think something like that would have served her character a lot better. Although I think we could have done without the rape scene altogether. Yeah,
I agree. That was a moment too that I was not super fond of. I was like, you don't need this, you know, because it's like already the alien, the xenomorph itself is a metaphor for rape, so you don't need a literal attempted rape in it. It's kind of like a hat on a hat. And also, like, yeah, you said, like, she is, if Dylan doesn't show up there, so it all happens. So, like, that's basically, she needed to get saved by a man. And that's the only point in this movie where she does. She is so confident and strong and just, like, in all of these movies, she's the badass. She's the one saving other people. To have her in this very traditional moment, like, you know, saved by the guy who, you know, it didn't really jive with a lot of the other stuff that had been happening to that point, I think.
And also, you had mentioned a while back about the fact that this is a very different alien design. Unless I'm mistaken, I think this is the first time in the franchise where we established that the xenomorph takes on the qualities of whatever the host that it was born from. Because in the other movies, it's always been human hosts. This is the first time that we see it come out of an animal, right? In the theatrical cut, it was a dog. In the assembly cut, it was an ox. So we see, like, this more bestial version of the alien. And, like, Ripley even says at one point, I've never seen one that moves like this before. So it's more of a, also when she describes it as like a lion, right? She says it's a lion. It likes to stay close to the zebras. And they went for, whereas in the last one, it was kind of like, you know, they kept using the bug metaphor. It was like an infestation, all this. This one, they make it seem more like a wild animal. I think it worked really well in this movie.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the way it kind of like stalks them, you know, like a lion or something like that, or, you know, there's Golik keeps calling it like a dragon. It's got that like almost like primeval, like this thing that we would just be like afraid of. It's less human like, you know, like we said, this is the first time in these alien movies that we get to see it born from something else, which I think is a cool bit of world building too. But yeah, it gives it a different vibe. It's a way for the movies to feel like they're less repetitive, while also staying true and like not having to come up with some contrivance. I thought that was a really nice touch.
Yeah. And too, the way that it moves too, like, obviously there's similarities to the first one with it going through the vents and all that. But in the first one, we had never seen it filmed like this one. This one, we are seeing it from the alien's point of view. We are looking through the xenomorph's eyes as it is scurrying through the vents. And I thought that was a really neat trick that Fincher did.
Yeah, it gets that kind of camera angle that's kind of like distorted. It's long. It's you kind of just you're seeing it stalking these
moving
guys
all over.
Yeah, and then they're trying to like they're like, okay, we got to get into this one. That's like the whole finale. Like there's 2 points where they're like trying to get it into certain places. They can trap it and stuff like that. I do have a little bit of the problem that the geography seems a little bit unclear at certain times because it's all just like gray hallways and stuff like that. But they are just like trying to like, we'll get it over here, we'll get it over here. Like it's stalking them like a wolf or something like that, just hunting these guys down. And I think that aspect is, it maybe feels a little bit more like almost instinctual. And that carries over to the fact that, it's not going to hurt Ripley because it senses that she's carrying the queen on her. It just feels like this thing is terrifying because there is no rhyme or reason to it. It's not even necessarily killing people because it's hungry or something. So it's not like, oh, well, it's like at Jurassic Park. They're like, oh, well, the T-Rex just ate, so we don't have to worry about it for a while. It's like, no, this thing is just going to keep killing and killing and killing. Why? Because that's all it does.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned this line, but when she says like, I'm part of the family now, like that was, no, you'd mentioned the other line. You've been in my life for so long. I don't remember anything else, which is, I agree. That's one of my standout lines for this movie. And it really shows like how much she has been, and in each one of these movies, Ripley has been kind of an outsider, but she's been a kind of reluctant outsider, or been like kind of forced into an outsider position. Whereas, in the first one, she's part of the crew, but she's kind of different. Like she's one of only 2 women, and she is the more stoic of the 2. The more, right, like when they come in and they're like, we have to keep it in quarantine. She's very strict on the quarantine procedure. She's like, no, we have to keep this in quarantine. And then everybody else is like, what is wrong with you? This is our friend. We got to bring him in. Like she's the only one who's got her shit together in that.
If they listen to her, no, we don't have to worry about any of this shit happening.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they just listen to her. And in the second movie, right, she's among all these military grunts. And so she's kind of forced into an outsider position there as well, too. But, she still seems to have some camaraderie a little bit, like obviously later on with Hicks, at the beginning, a little bit at first kind of with Burke. She seems to kind of have a kind of trust thing with him. And then eventually, obviously, that's broken pretty quickly. And then she's got Newt, obviously, too. And then in this movie, she is completely put into the outsider position, and she is viewed just as much of a threat to this society as the xenomorph is, right? There are several. I think like this is probably one thing where the movie didn't quite play it up as well as it should. I feel like that aspect gets kind of papered over a little bit once the xenomorph starts killing everybody. But I did think that was an interesting change. Whereas this part, not only is she an outsider, but she's an outsider in very hostile territory.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing it also does is her being this outsider, her like now carrying the queen and everything, and just being like the only woman is like she's treated very differently. And they also like, hey, quarantine her, keep her away because she is important. And we know that the company's coming. So that also adds this ticking clock element to this movie that isn't at all in the first 2. So it's like, okay, we have to kill this thing, or we have to like at least survive long enough to will they come, but they're not here to save us. That's one thing that keeps coming up over and over again. It's like, this company is not here to save us. They will kill all of us to get to this alien. So if we can find a way to kill it, we should. And Sigourney's also like, I probably need to die before they show up because I am, the carrier now of this thing. So I think that whole element of like, what there is going to be, they kill the alien, they have this whole thing, and then you're like, right as they're showing up, right as the real version, quote unquote, of Bishop, which I think also maybe is implied is also an android.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because with the ear kind of falling off, which is a great moment for 85, by the way. You're like, okay, good for you, and then he, of course, gets shot. But yeah, that whole, what we have to do this all quickly before these guys show up, and that's finally when you actually see the guns, is when these, quote, the military men, the company men show up and just gun innocent people down. So I thought that was a really good finale.
On the Bishop thing, I'm pretty sure that, because he's Wayland in Lance Henriksen plays Wayland in like Alien versus Predator. I think in Prometheus, wasn't there like a cameo or something with him playing Wayland or something like that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think there's. I kind of think that I think AVP might be decanonized because of Prometheus, because it's Guy Pearce is Wayland in those movies.
Well, he. Oh yeah, that's right. You're right. In Prometheus, he was Wayland. Okay, yeah, I got. Yeah, he's Charles Bishop Wayland is who he was in who he was supposed to be. So yeah, my read on that is always this been another android, especially that scene where he says like I'm not a droid. Yeah, you're right. I didn't like that in the in Prometheus that they undid that. I did like the idea that he was always Wayland, and this is just like these androids were based on him instead.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm of the minority that I kind of like Prometheus a lot. I thought it was pretty good, and I'm just not a fan of the Alien versus Predator movies. But yeah, I do think he definitely is a robot. It just speaks to kind of the manipulation, the lies that this company will kind of always go to. The like, all right, we'll make another advanced android. We'll send it there to find another way to just manipulate her. So I thought that was a good touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, if I'm not mistaken, that I'm not a droid shot. I don't believe that was in the theatrical cut. I think that was something they cut out of it. So, and also one of the other things that they did in the assembly cut, which is much better, is that in the theatrical cut, as Ripley is falling, the queen bursts out of her chest. So there's this, it was done that way because they felt like, well, we have to make it obvious that the alien's coming up or something like that. But it works so much better in this movie without seeing the alien burst out, because again, it's like maybe there would have been a chance for her to choose another route, but it was more important for her to make sure that this threat is ended right here, right now, under her own means.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty cheesy too, that like her just bursting out of there. Like, it's a way more powerful moment when she just kind of falls back with her arms outstretched, and that's the end of Ripley's story. And I think that is this is definitely a movie that I know you said you hadn't seen, before we were getting on, you said you hadn't seen the theatrical since you were younger. I actually have never seen the theatrical, but I have read up on a lot of the differences. And I think that, a lot of those decisions that were made by Fox execs that really, turned Fincher off to the movie. And there was other things before that, with the script writing process and how it was being rewritten when they were filmed, that contributed to the movie not being everything that it should have been. But Fincher, who obviously now he's David Fincher, but back then this is his first movie he's ever directing. He's a guy who's only ever done music videos and worked on sets like Return of the Jedi and stuff like that. But this is the first time he's going to be the director, and he has a very bad experience. But I do think they really did a good job of putting together this assembly cut. Some of the other differences, obviously, there's about 30 minutes of extra stuff. Things are explained a lot more. There's a lot more characterization in this one. Obviously, one of the big things is Golik's whole storyline. He kind of just in the theatrical, you don't really know how the alien gets out of the thing, and he just kind of disappears at one point. And the beginning montage showing what's happening on Ripley's ship before it crashes, where you're just getting these clips. I thought that was almost terrifying, whereas it's just showing you clips and it's just be that little the hand thing will just be going on the face, and it's just showing you these. It's a montage of all these things happening before the movie gets started, and I thought that was incredibly well done.
Something too interesting about the theatrical cut versus the assembly cut is that in the theatrical cut, in that when they're going through this different stuff, they show an image of Michael Biehn as Hicks at one point, and Michael Biehn never signed off to have his likeness in this movie. So he sued, and he actually ended up getting paid for that one clip of himself. Then he got his entire salary for Aliens.
That's pretty funny. That's pretty great.
But I do want to talk a little bit about the development, because this was just a nightmare of development. There's actually a documentary made about it too, about what a pain in the ass it was. And it was, I don't know if you know about the original teaser trailer for this movie.
Yes, I do. It's coming to Earth.
Yeah, so there was this, the tagline for the first movie, famously, in space, no one can hear you scream. So the teaser trailer for this one, it ended with on Earth, everybody can hear you scream. So it was the idea like the alien is finally going to come to Earth this time. And that was the original idea. And obviously that did not happen. And there are lots of different treatments and ideas for it. David Giler and Walter Hill and Gordon Carroll, they wanted to explore more about Weyland-Yutani, and they wanted to explore more about the idea of what happens when Weyland-Yutani actually does get the alien and is able to use it as a bioweapon. And it would have been a 2-part story, with the first part featuring Hicks as kind of like the lead character. Ripley would have just appeared as like a cameo, and then she would return in the 4th movie. And it would have like a very big Cold War element to it. But they didn't end up doing that.
Then the Cold War ended, so they kind of were like, this is kind of outdated now, yeah.
Which, I mean, still would have worked, because you still had the Vietnam metaphor in Alien, so I don't know. But, it's studio execs. And then they went to William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, cyberpunk novel, to do it as well. And he was very interested in the kind of like Marxist space empire element. So he was really interested in doing it up. And he
Rennie Harlin, I think, comes on around that time to direct.
Yeah, Rennie Harlin was involved in it at one point too. And it was very action oriented. It would have an extended cast. And apparently this version of the screenplay is floating around there in fact, there's an audiobook version of the unproduced screenplay on Audible. So I think that'd be really interesting to check out.
Yeah, there is actually a physical book too because I mean, there's like 4 or 5 different scripts, but the William Gibson version of the script too is definitely available as like a book you can just read.
Yeah, there's also versions of, there are lots of comic book stories that came out before Alien 3 that involved Hicks and an adult Newt going back to the alien planet. So there was that aspect too, and they eventually had to, after Alien 3, they had to reprint those comics and change the characters' names.
Right.
David Twohy worked on it too at one point, and I think that was eventually what came. I think his Pitch Black was actually originally started as his Alien 3 script.
Really?
Which you can definitely see some of that DNA in there. And then Vincent Ward was kind of the one that he also directed What Dreams May Come. And his idea is where the whole religious aspect of it came through. Except it would have been a very different. They would have been like Luddite type monks. The planet would have, very archaic design and structures on it. So
yeah, it would have been a planet made of wood, which sounds kind of awesome to me, honestly.
Yeah. It sounds very weird and very different, but the production crew didn't like the concept of it. So like there were lots of logical problems with creating a wooden. I mean, I think maybe the planet being made of wood is kind of a weird thing, but like the idea of her going to this planet where they've kind of renounced technology in this would have been an interesting way to handle it. And then they kind of cobble together these different elements of it. So it's got all these, you'd see some of the DNA of all these different aspects coming into it here and there.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's, like we mentioned, there's the script where they're monks, and then there's like another script where they're like prisoners on this very industrial planet, and they kind of just combine them in a way that doesn't super like. That's why it's like okay, so they're prisoners, but they're also just happen to still be here, and they also are like super religious, so they're like monk prisoners, and it's like, why would you come up with that? It's like, well, they didn't. They just combined a bunch of different elements from all these different scripts, because and there's clearly DNA from all of these different elements over the years of all these different things being worked into it. Like there was for a while, like you said, that Ripley wasn't even going to be in this movie, and so I think that kind of. And, like I said, Rennie Harlin was originally supposed to be the director of this. He dropped out because he was like, this thing is taking forever. It's stuck in developmental hell. It's, like the geopolitical situation had completely changed by the time the script was written to when they were like trying to get ready to film. Like I said, there was a script where they were originally going to go back to Earth, and that ended up not happening. And scripts or sets are being built as the movie's filming. And there's all these people who are just like, David never had a complete script. Fincher never he would have scenes and he'd be like ready to shoot them, and then some exec would come down like, nope, we're not shooting this scene. Actually, we're throwing that one out. It's too expensive. Do something else. And so it seemed like a very arduous process. And so the fact that they were able to get something, I think, this good out of it, this assembly cut, someone was able to look at all this stuff that David Fincher had done, and not even Fincher himself, but somebody else was able to stitch this together and make it this competent and interesting of a film. Really speaks to not only his vision, but like everyone, all the different scriptwriters, the great acting done in it, all this stuff, like the incredible, the sets are kind of like whatever, but I think that the creature design is always H.R. Geiger came back, did the new creature design for this one. That's phenomenal. So the fact that this was all cobbled together, that it was this good, it really speaks to it. And you can really see, even though it's very early, even though he was clearly had studio meddling, flashes of that Fincher just brilliance. The scene I always think of is the scene where everybody kind of is introduced to the alien, and you don't even really see him. But it's got the warden, and he's squeezing that like stress ball that he's had the whole movie, and he's like, he's basically saying like, this is all bullshit. Ripley, you don't know what you're talking about. Get the fuck out of here. And then he just gets yoinked up, and the ball just kind of falls, and somebody just goes, fuck. And you're like, that's some Fincherism right there. Like, that's nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that, because again, I'm watching this last night, and I've only got the original 2003 DVD version. I understand now there's a Blu-ray version that has gone through remastering, and the sound mixing is much better, because there were times in that 2003 version where I'm like turning up the volume at certain scenes that were inserted in, and then turning them back down. And so I have to get the Blu-ray version of this movie. But it is amazing that they got something this good from just like Fincher's notes and like what in the editing room. And because like you said, he's completely disowned this film. In 2009, he told The Guardian that no one hated it more than me. To this day, no one hates it more than me. And I would love to see like what he would do with an actual director's cut if they'd given him the budget for this and to actually go through and do this the way he wanted, or based on what the footage is done. If he could get like like Richard Donner got to do with his version of Superman 2, I would love to see that version of it. And it's funny, this was his first movie, his first big budget production. Like before this, he'd just been a music video director. And he I remember in the documentary, Sigourney Weaver was talking about the first time she met Fincher. And they're in a meeting, and like, Fincher was just kind of like sitting in the meeting, he's just being quiet, he's not saying anything. And then Sigourney Weaver, she's like, well, nobody's talking to him. Nobody's asking him his opinion about any of this. She just turns to him and she asks him, she's like, so how do you see Ripley in this movie? And he just looks at her and he's like, bald.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating to see, what everyone was doing on this. And it would be cool to see like a true director's cut from Fincher. But in a way, I am kind of glad that it wasn't, because obviously, he doesn't want anything to do with it. And I think that, because like I said, people have, because of like their auteur theory and everything, people tend to think of like directors as the sole visionary people. So when it comes time to make a definitive cut of the movie, it's like, well, we'll get the director the credit, like he'll do his true version. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this whole miniseries, extended editions, is because I wanted to kind of examine like, what's the point of director's cut? Like, why do we like them so much? Why are they often, we take underrated movies and make better versions of them? And I think that, oftentimes, if, the other one that I just talked about last week was Dr. Sleep from Mike Flanagan. Flanagan wrote, directed, and edited that movie. So it makes sense that he would have his definitive stamp on the movie. But, Fincher didn't write this. I mean, I know that he's very much a very hands-on editor, but he's not the credited editor on this movie. That would be Terry Rollins. So I think that it really does speak to the collaborative process of filmmaking. And, I love that they were like, okay, Fincher is one of the people who made this, but he's not the only guy, and that's why like assembly implies multiple people and coming together and making this thing, which I think is really cool. I brought up Dune earlier. There's actually, I haven't watched it yet, but there's actually a fan edit that somebody did of using like deleted scenes and like footage from TV shows and stuff like that. It's called like the Spice Diver cut. You can find it on YouTube, and it's like 3 hours long of Dune. One I've talked about on this show before, which I think is one of the greatest extended editions of all time, and one I would be talking about if I hadn't already covered it in the past, is The Thief and the Cobbler. Like the fact that they were able to, no pun intended, cobble that together from like all these like unfinished things and like scenes that were cut to give it something more in line with Richard Williams' original vision, without any of his involvement, I think is really cool. And I think that this one absolutely fulfills the same thing, where it's just like, oh yeah, a lot of people worked on this. Here's Fincher's vision, but we can still like collaborate and make it all together.
Yeah, I think those are good points you make. And I think about, I mentioned the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2 before. And I think that's a good example of kind of both the good and bad of director's cuts, because yes, on the one hand, most of the film is superior to Richard Lester's version. But on the other hand, there's still some things in it that don't quite work. Like one of the best lines in any version of that movie is in the theatrical cut when Superman comes to the Daily Planet and he says to Zod, he's like, "General, would you care to step outside?" And then that is not in the Donner cut, because that was something that Lester had filmed. So in the Donner cut, it's, "General, haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press?" or something like that. And I'm just like, this doesn't have the same impact of it. He also retains the he also brings back the turning back time ending that he had originally planned to do for the second movie, but he ended up using it for the first movie because, and again, this is idiot Hollywood writer brain, because Tom Mankiewicz, who had done a lot of good work on it, objected to Donner using the amnesia kiss scene from the Lester version and he said, like, Superman, he's like, "Clark Kent should not kiss Lois. Only Superman should kiss Lois." I'm like, okay, what? That doesn't make any sense. And so then he decided to reuse but I'm like, the perfect ending for that movie is when he drops Lois off at her apartment and then he flies off and she has that melancholy line of like, "There he goes again," or something like that. I'm like, that's the perfect ending for that movie. She knows they're not together, but she still knows the secret. Like, that is the perfect way to end that movie. But he felt like he had to put that genie back in the bottle of the secret identity, and I don't think that was necessary, and I definitely don't think it works. And again, I'm going back to the superhero stuff because I've been so clued into the DCEU lately, but Zack Snyder's Justice League, lots of things about that are superior to Joss Whedon's Frankenstein version of it. But you still have some weird moments, like some really unnecessary slow motion in that movie that we just do not need. You've got, this scene where, Martha gives this talk to Lois, and then afterwards we find out it's actually Martian Manhunter, and then we see him again in full form at the end, which basically says, hey, Martian Manhunter, he's as powerful as Superman. He knows all this stuff's going on, but he's sitting on the sidelines. So you're making one of the most powerful members of the Justice League a coward in that scene. Or you look at Patty Jenkins in Wonder Woman 1984, where she's given even more control than she had over the first one, and it's just absolute dog shit. So it's like there's a definite argument to be made that directors are not always the be all end all final word on these things.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting you bring up the Donner cut, which is, it was around the 2000s. Obviously, that's when we got the the Alien quadrilogy, as they call it, of where you got all the different directors / assembly cuts, and that's when all these directors cuts, because of like DVDs coming into the picture, because of all this other stuff that they were able to do with films that they weren't really able to do before with like home video releases. You are starting to get these quote unquote alternate versions, these other cuts, these things that directors would have to like take it on the like. Ridley Scott would have to take Kingdom of Heaven on like a road show or something, but now it's like you can just release that version. The Donner cut, like you mentioned, was one of the first big ones. It gets this big movement, this groundswell of fan support, like, hey, we want to see the actual, quote unquote, the actual version of this movie. And I think it is interesting. We do have to weigh, like, okay, what do we really want to see when we get these director's cuts? What is the definitive real version of this movie? Like, what are we losing? And a lot of times it's stuff like, yeah, this is a movie that had a lot of studio interference, so we want to see the version that would have gotten made had he not gotten fired, and Donner had not gotten fired, or had Fincher been able to make his full vision. But sometimes it's also just stuff like, hey, we have a movie like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Let's do a longer cut version where the director did still probably have creative control, but this is the stuff they couldn't put in. So I think the differences in the reasoning behind these cuts is always something that really fascinates me.
Yeah, and sometimes you have stuff where Blade Runner had like, what, 4 or 5 different cuts of that movie?
Yeah.
And but then you also have stuff like when they did bring it back to the realm of Alien, when they did that quadrilogy box set, they went to Ridley Scott and they asked him to do a director's cut of Alien, and he's just kind of like, I did my director's cut. It's called Alien. And they're just like, well, come on, can you do something? And he's like, okay, fine. So he went back, he re-edited it, and it's like, I think it's actually 1 minute shorter than the theatrical
shorter. Yeah,
cut.
they cut that long sequence he put some other stuff in, but he cuts that very long sequence, which I think is, it's one of the few director's cuts that's shorter.
And he'd even said, and I think in the introduction to it, he's like, yeah, so even though they asked me to do a director's cut, my director's cut is really the theatrical version. That's the one you should watch.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's, to generalize a lot, there's mostly 3 reasons you would do a director's cut. There's here, what we talked about, like it's studio interference, or it just didn't come together the way it should have for whatever reason. So here is a version that has a lot of extra stuff, things that make a lot more sense. It's a more complete movie. It is kind of a more definitive version, is Alien 3. Then I think Aliens is something where it's like, Aliens is pretty much the same movie, but there is a lot of important added context. Like you mentioned earlier on, there's the stuff with her daughter that adds, it's the same movie, but it makes it a little bit more powerful. And I think that you probably would classify some of the Lord of the Rings in that too.
And in fact, I'm not sure how much of that Fincher knew about the stuff about, like, with Ripley's real daughter and all that, but it strangely works, right? Because the line when Clemens asks her if she's married, and at first she doesn't answer, and then later she says no, right? I mean, so again, her daughter's father is never mentioned at all in any of these movies, so we don't know what the situation was, if she was a single mother, if she was married, if it was like an IVF situation. If her daughter was adopted even, like, we don't know any of that. We have none of that context. All we know is that she had a daughter on Earth before she went into space. And then while she was in hypersleep between Alien and Aliens, the daughter grew old and died. That's all we know. But that added context, it makes this movie so much more impactful for those themes, especially those themes of motherhood, right? Because she loses her daughter because of the alien. She loses her surrogate daughter because of the alien. And in its place, she is now going to give birth to the thing that took her children away from her. It is so poetically tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's what I said. That's why I think that the Alien, it's, Aliens, that's not necessarily the definitive cut the way this one is, but it does provide that context that it improves not only that film, but as you put it very well, it improves this film as well. And then I think, like you said, with the first Alien, the director's cut is just there to kind of just like tinker and give you some extra stuff. So here's some extra scenes you didn't see that are, cool to see in the actual film itself. So I think that comparing the 3 director's cuts / extended editions of Aliens is a really interesting way to look at, like, why do we have these cuts?
Yeah. Well, I do think going back to Alien, one of the things that the director's cut added in that it was not in the theatrical cut was the scene where Dallas and Brett are in cocoons as she's escaping from the Nostromo, which fits in more with what we see in the second one, and then obviously in the third one too. I don't remember if there was a scene of that in the third one in the assembly cut, but I think there was something that was shot and not used, because I remember seeing someone talk about that somewhere.
Yeah, I think that you're right, because I just watched it, and there's not a scene of that, but I think because there's obviously a lot of stuff that was like being shot and thrown out because it didn't work or whatever, like it didn't, like, the script had changed, so it no longer made sense to have that in there or anything like that. But I think it's like an interesting piece of lore, and it brings back these characters from that, like, earlier on in the film, kind of gives them a nice little final scene, puts a little period at the end of their sentence.
Right. Those are kind of like the biggest things I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about it?
That was pretty much it. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that I do love that the end of this movie actually does something different. Of the 4 original Alien movies, one of my few complaints is that they all kill the alien at the end in the same way, which is by blowing it out of an airlock. Which, first Alien movie, that happens, really cool. That's a great way to kill the alien. They bring it back in the second one. She kills the queen. You're like, oh, okay. A nice callback to the first one. I'm glad they didn't do it again here, because when they do it again in Resurrection, you're like, you've already done this. I've already seen this. I'm glad that there was, just like the alien itself was different, that the finale was different. And then that actually ended up not being the most important part of the finale. The most important part of the finale is it puts the focus, when they're coming to trying to get her, it puts the focus on Ripley and not the alien. And then she has that moment where she, with arms outstretched, falls back into the fire, sacrificing herself, ending her story perfectly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that too, that I like that they went back to that original message from the first movie, and it ends, this is Ripley, last survivor of the Nostromo, signing off. I think that's it. And it's just boom, like message ended or something like that, or something.
Yeah, and transmission,
and transmission, yeah. I thought that was perfect. I thought that was a great send off for the movie, and just like her character too. Like Resurrection is a whole other thing, right? It's a clone. It's not her, so I don't even want to think about it. And that weird alien hybrid thing we see at the end, which doesn't even make sense because the xenomorphs are hybrids to begin with. So I don't know. It's just that movie was just a total mess. But yeah, this one, it's a solid film. Does it reach the highs of Alien or Aliens? No, probably not. If we're being honest. But it's got some great characters in it. It does have some great moments, and thematically, all these 3 movies work together in a way that I think people don't really, who dismiss this movie, don't really give it credit to. And they just kind of have this knee-jerk reaction to, well, they killed Hicks and Newt, and that's and James Cameron even said that's a slap in the face. I'm like, dude, this is a franchise about survival horror. Obviously, not all these characters are going to survive. It totally fits with Ripley's journey that she's going to have these people dying all around her. Could you have a situation where maybe they last for a little bit longer on Fury 161? Yeah, maybe. Could you have had there are obviously little tweaks and stuff you could have made here and there, but overall I am very happy with this trilogy as a whole. The themes going from like the impersonal to the very personal by the end, the themes of motherhood, the themes of sexual violence and survivors. And too, now that I didn't talk about this at all in my original paper because that was like 20 years ago that I wrote that, but in light of all the discussions that people are having in America about abortion and reproductive rights and all that with the overthrow of Roe v. Wade, those themes were very heavy in my mind as I was watching this movie. And when she talks about how she was violated and now she's been impregnated with her rapist baby, right? That's another thing too. And then she's dealing with, because there are some, as insane as it might sound to say this, and maybe some people would push back on this, but she does seem to have some conflicting feelings over whether or not she wants to kill this thing inside her.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that all that stuff is very much from Alien 1, very in the text. And this one, it happens to other people. Other people are quote unquote violated by the aliens. So they have the chest bursters. Interesting. They do some interesting subversions by having it happen to the men in that one. But yeah, this is the one where it's like, okay, now it is happening to Ripley. All the stuff you said about reproductive rights and sexual violence and all that stuff, I think is very much in the text here. not to bring up Resurrection again, but, you talked about the conflictingness of her not being sure. I think that's played a lot more on the nose and up front in Alien Resurrection, where it's just the right amount of subtlety where you kind of just get that from her performance. She's not like crying as she's blowing it out the airlock or whatever. I think it's played much, much better here.
No, yeah, like the whole thing when she tells Dylan, she's like, I need you to kill me. I can't do it myself. Like it's, I think that scene can be read two ways. Like you can read it one way as maybe it's some sort of influence that the queen is having over her, that she's not able to kill herself. Or maybe it is this thing where she just emotionally, she can't do it. Like there's that aspect of it too. And I think it's a very interesting aspect of it that she plays it with just the right amount of subtlety to make you think, well, wait a minute, why don't you kill yourself? Why are you hesitating about this? You're talking about how, and then when you look at it from that emotional point of view, it actually kind of makes sense. Whereas in Alien Resurrection, it takes it to these really bizarre extremes, like that weird, I guess, mother-child scene between her and the hybrid, which is just creepy as hell.
it's a whole other that movie. It's fair to say I'm not going to ever cover Alien Resurrection on this show. But yeah, Perry, thank you. Before I get you out of here, though, I do want to ask you a question, and it could be, if the answer is Alien 3, that's cool, but what is your favorite like extended edition or director's cut of a movie?
Oh, that is a good question. I wish you had asked me this in advance. I would have had time to think about it.
Sorry, I should have prepped you, but I've been asking all the guests on this miniseries that.
There's a really strong argument for Alien 3, and that one's fresh in my mind. So that one is kind of pushing. Although now that I think about it, I think the final cut of Blade Runner is really solid. So I think I might have to go with that.
Yeah, I will also say that I completely agree with the final cut of Blade Runner. I think that one is the definitive. Like we've talked about, what is a definitive version? That one really is. That's a movie where the theatrical cut really suffers from the studio interference with the voiceover. That it's just like it's very dumb. The original ending is terrible, and that is one where it's like it goes from being like kind of cheesy and like you're like, oh, it has some good ideas, but I think the final cut is just a straight up masterpiece. Yeah. And yeah, like Ridley Scott, I think, is one of those guys who, I'm actually really excited to see eventually what his cut of director's cut of Napoleon is, because that's another movie where I was like, this seems good, but it feels like there's stuff maybe missing. So, yeah, looking forward to that. But yeah, you really, Blade Runner, the final cut is kind of perfection. It's just kind of like a sci-fi masterpiece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you once again, Perry, for coming on. If you want to mention one more time in your podcasts.
Yeah, so if you like superhero movies, Superhero Cinephiles is the show where we talk all about those movies. That is at superherocinephiles.com. If you're interested in Japanese films, then that podcast is called Japan on Film. That's also japanonfilm.com. As far as Superhero Cinephiles, I'm not sure exactly when this is going to be coming out. As of March 26th, we have at least 2 more episodes of Superhero Cinephiles in the bank. Probably going to take a little bit of a hiatus after that point. And for Japan on Film, the 10th season is almost complete. We're still in the midst of, I think there may be like 1 or 2 episodes left to come out for the 10th season. But the 11th season is already pretty much all recorded. Just have 1 more episode to record for that. And that'll probably be coming out in July or August, maybe somewhere around there. So already I've got guests lined up for season 12. So we're moving along pretty well with that. So those you just type those into the search bar, or again, superherocinephiles.com, japanonfilm.com.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, definitely go and check those out. If anybody has, this is your first time listening to Underrated, I would love for you to keep checking us out. Give us a follow, rate us 5 stars. We are on, of course, all the podcast apps, also on all social media. So if you just look up Underrated Movie Podcast anywhere, we will come up. This is, of course, like I said, the 2nd episode in this miniseries. I've got 2 more episodes that we're going to be talking about. Black Hat next time, the director's cut of that, Michael Mann's version, and then of course, and it's going to finish with, speaking of Ridley Scott, with the Ridley Scott's director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven. So, check back with those. Excited to hear you guys hear that one. And yeah, also if you want to hear even more of me, you can check out my Patreon for Underrated, patreon.com/underrated movie podcast. Do 2 bonus podcasts there, as well as do a ton of other bonus content. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month and hear most of that $1, $3, or $5 options on there. But yeah, thank you once again, Perry, and I will see you guys next time.